There was a door in almost every American home that led somewhere else. Not to another room, to another world. A narrow staircase, wooden steps worn soft in the middle, disappearing into a darkness that smelled like damp earth, old wood, and something you couldn't quite name. Machine oil, maybe, or dust that had settled so long it had become part of the air itself. Most children were not afraid of that staircase. They were curious about it, because somewhere down there, past the coal bin, past the shelves nobody explained, was a man standing at a workbench, fixing something the rest of the house had already given up on. This was the basement. Not a storage room, not a place where things went to be forgotten. A basement, in a Depression-era home, was where broken things went to be saved. A chair with a cracked leg did not go to the curb, it went downstairs. A shoe with a split sole did not go in the trash. It went downstairs. A hoe with a loose handle, a lamp that stopped working, a toy a child had snapped in half. All of it went downstairs, into the hands of a father who had learned, out of necessity, that replacing something was a luxury his family often couldn't afford. For a lot of people raised by Depression-era parents, the basement was not a mystery. It was a workshop, a shelter, and a quiet classroom, all folded into one underground room that never made the news and never asked for credit. If you grew up watching your father disappear down those stairs after dinner, coming back up an hour later with something fixed and no explanation offered, you were watching something most modern homes have completely lost. Because today, the room under the house has changed. For many families, it holds a projector screen, a treadmill nobody uses, and boxes that have not been opened since the day they were carried down there. It has become the place where things go to be ignored, not repaired. The basement did not lose its purpose overnight. It lost it one habit at a time. One broken thing sent to a landfill instead of a workbench. One repair replaced by a delivery. One father's skill replaced by a phone call to someone else. This is the story of what that room used to hold. Not just tools. Not just jars and scraps and coils of wire nobody threw away. It held the quiet proof that a family, even a poor one, was not helpless. They were poor sometimes, but down in that basement, they had everything they needed to prove they could still take care of themselves. The stairs were always the first lesson, before anyone said a single word. They were narrow, sometimes uneven, sometimes without a proper railing at all. A child learned quickly to go down slowly, one hand on the cold stone or brick wall, the other reaching for nothing in particular, just balance. There was no light switch at the top in a lot of houses. You found the string, or the switch at the bottom, by memory, because you had done this 100 times before and would do it 100 times again. The air changed before the eyes adjusted, warmer in winter, strangely, because the furnace lived down there too, its metal body ticking and creaking as it worked through the night. Cooler in summer, a relief from a kitchen that had been holding heat all day, and always that smell, damp concrete, sawdust, the faint metallic trace of tools that had been oiled to keep the rust away, because rust meant a tool you couldn't trust, and a tool you couldn't trust was as good as no tool at all. In many American homes during the Depression years, the basement was not finished. It was not carpeted, not painted, not decorated with anything meant to be looked at. It was built for use, and everyone in the house understood the difference between a room meant to be seen and a room meant to be worked in. Along one wall, there was usually a bench, not bought from a store, more often built by the same hands that would use it. A few thick boards, sometimes salvaged from a crate or an old piece of furniture, that had given up its original shape to become something more useful. Above it, nails driven into the wood at careful intervals, each one holding something specific. A hammer here, a hand saw there, coils of wire, loops of rope, leather scraps cut from a boot too far gone to repair, but not too far gone to become something else. A hinge pad, a strap, a patch for another shoe still worth saving. This was not clutter. This was a system, and every person in the family who paid attention long enough could tell you exactly what it meant. A jar of mismatched screws was not laziness, it was insurance. Because buying a single screw meant a trip to town, a few cents spent, and a few cents was not something a family spent twice if they could help it. A coffee can of bent nails, straightened and reused, was not something to be embarrassed about. It was proof that someone in that house understood the difference between what was truly gone and what only needed a little patience. But here is the part nobody likes to admit when they talk about the simple old days. This wasn't quaint. It wasn't charming in the moment it was happening. It was often exhausting, and it came from real fear. The fear of a family that could not afford for anything to be truly broken. Because broken, back then, could mean gone for good. A father coming home from a day of paid work, or worse, a day of no work at all, did not get to rest the way rest is understood today. He went downstairs, because the chair leg had cracked that morning, and dinner was in a few hours, and 6 people were going to need somewhere to sit. He did not complain about it, not out loud, not where the children could hear. He worked in near silence, the sound of sandpaper against wood, or a hand plane shaving a thin curl off a board, or the quiet tap of a hammer finding a nail exactly where it needed to go. There was something almost meditative about it, though no one back then would have used that word. It was simply what a man did when the family needed the chair fixed and there was no money for a new one, and likely wouldn't be for a long while. A child, sent downstairs to fetch a jar of nails or a spool of thread kept near the workbench for reasons no one explained, would often stop at the bottom of the stairs and just watch. Not because they were told to learn something, because there was something to watching a person solve a problem with nothing but their hands, a few tools, and whatever scraps had been saved for exactly this kind of moment. That child did not always understand what they were witnessing. Decades later, many of them would. The basement held more than a workbench, though. In houses where money was thin enough that every corner of the home had to serve more than one purpose, the basement became a second kitchen of sorts, not for cooking, but for holding what the family couldn't afford to lose. Empty glass containers lined up not as trash waiting to be thrown out, but as a kind of quiet promise. This will be useful again, we just don't know exactly when. A worn-out coat did not go in a bin. It went to the basement, folded on a shelf, waiting for a smaller body to grow into it, or for its buttons to be removed and saved for something else entirely. A pair of boots with a split seam did not go to the curb. They went down those stairs, into a father's hands, to be stitched, patched, or at the very least, understood well enough to know exactly how many more winters they had left in them. This is where the story stops being nostalgic and starts becoming uncomfortable, if you let it. Because what this really reveals is how thin the margin was. A family did not save nails and buttons and scraps of leather because they were charmingly frugal. They did it because a broken chair, an unfixable pair of shoes, or a coat too worn to patch represented a cost they might not survive without real consequences. Somebody might go without shoes that winter. Somebody might sit on the floor because there weren't enough chairs. The basement wasn't a hobby room. It was where the fear lived, and where that fear was met, night after night, with patience and skill instead of panic. And this is where the old home showed its strength. Because the basement did not just store objects, it stored ability. A father who knew how to resole a shoe, straighten a nail, rebuild a chair leg, or rewire a lamp was not simply saving money in that moment. He was making sure his family had a father who could solve problems without needing anyone else's permission, anyone else's schedule, or anyone else's bill. That same discipline appeared in another corner of the basement, where the tools for repairing not just household objects, but livelihoods were kept. In homes connected to farm work or small trades, the basement or cellar held the equipment that kept a family's income alive. A hoe with a handle that had been replaced twice, a harness stitched back together more times than anyone could count, a hand tool sharpened on a stone kept specifically for that purpose. These were not sentimental keepsakes. They were the difference between working tomorrow and not working tomorrow. In homes shaped by the Great Depression, a broken tool wasn't an inconvenience. It was a threat to the next paycheck, the next harvest, the next meal on the table. The basement, then, was not a museum of frugality. It was the family's insurance policy, built not from money, because there wasn't much of that, but from skill, patience, and materials too valuable to throw away. For a lot of people raised by Depression-era parents, none of this needed to be explained. It simply was. A grandmother who saved buttons in a tin. A grandfather who could fix a radio without a manual. A father who tested a frayed cord before deciding it needed replacing at all. These were not eccentricities passed down as family jokes. They were survival skills, still practiced decades after the actual crisis that created them had ended, because once a person learns that broken doesn't have to mean gone, they rarely unlearn it. And that is exactly why so many basements, well into the 1950s and 1960s, still looked the same way, still smelled the same way, still held a father at a workbench in the evening, quietly proving to no one in particular that his family was not helpless, even when money was tight, even when the world outside felt uncertain again. The room under the house was never just a room. It was where a family's ability to take care of itself lived. One repaired chair, one resoled shoe, one straightened nail at a time. But the basement did more than fix what was already broken. It prepared for what hadn't broken yet. There is a difference between reacting to a problem and expecting one, and the old basement was built for the second kind of thinking. A family that had lived through hard years did not wait for the roof to leak before they thought about what they would patch it with. They did not wait for a winter coat to fail before they had already set aside the wool scraps that might repair it. The basement held not just the tools for today's crisis, but the materials for tomorrow's, because tomorrow's crisis was never a question of if. It was only a question of when. This is where the old home revealed something modern homes rarely have to think about anymore: the difference between being broke and being unprepared. A family could be entirely out of extra money and still not be unprepared, because preparation, in that basement, did not cost anything beyond attention and patience. A coffee can of mismatched screws cost nothing but the discipline to save them instead of throwing them away. A shelf of clean, empty jars cost nothing but the foresight to imagine a future need before it arrived. This was a kind of wealth that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with whether a family had trained itself to look ahead. A mother, checking in on the basement while her husband worked, might glance at the shelf of buttons, thread, and folded fabric scraps and know, without needing to ask, that there was enough there to patch every piece of clothing in the house at least once more. That knowledge was quiet, but it was not small. It was the difference between panic and calm when a sleeve tore or a seam split. The family already had what it needed. It always had, because someone had made sure of it, months or years before the need ever arrived. That same logic extended to the tools themselves. A handsaw, a hammer, a set of chisels. These were not luxuries. They were treated the way modern families might treat insurance paperwork or an emergency fund, except they lived on a wall instead of in a bank. Because when a chair broke, when a fence post rotted, when a door came off its hinge, the question in a Depression-era home was never, who do we call? The question was, what do we already have to fix this ourselves? That question does not get asked in most homes anymore. And here is where the story turns, because the point is not to say the old way was easy, or noble, or something to feel guilty for not living up to. The point is to notice what quietly disappeared, and how. The modern home did not lose its basement workshop in one dramatic moment. Nobody woke up one day and decided that repair was pointless. It disappeared the way most things disappear from a home, slowly, one small decision at a time, each one reasonable on its own, until decades later the room downstairs looked nothing like it used to. It started, in a lot of homes, with convenience arriving faster than skill could keep up. A new appliance came with a warranty instead of a repair manual, and warranties quietly taught an entire generation that fixing something yourself was no longer necessary, or even advisable. A broken item wasn't a problem to solve anymore. It was a problem to report, to a company, to a service line, to someone else entirely. Then it became about time. Repairing a chair took an evening. Buying a new one took 20 minutes and a credit card. And convenience did not make the case that it was better. It simply made the case that it was faster, and faster, over time, became the only argument that seemed to matter. Somewhere between convenience and credit, the house forgot how to defend itself. Walk into a lot of basements today, and you will find something very different from a workbench lined with tools sorted by function. You'll find a home theater, a folded-up treadmill nobody uses anymore, and stacks of cardboard boxes that have not been opened since the day they were carried down there, half forgotten, half dreaded, representing not preparation, but avoidance. The room has not disappeared. It has simply changed jobs. It went from a place where problems were solved to a place where problems, and unwanted objects, are sent to be ignored. There is no father down there most evenings anymore, not because fathers today are less capable or less caring, but because the entire system that basement used to represent, patience, materials, skill, and the expectation that a family fixes what it can, has been replaced by something else. A phone call, a service appointment, a next-day delivery. None of these are villains on their own, but together, they represent a home that has quietly outsourced its own ability to take care of itself. Modern homes have more buttons, but fewer plans. And this is the uncomfortable part, the part worth sitting with instead of rushing past. A lot of us grew up watching that transition happen without understanding what we were losing. We didn't miss the basement workshop because we didn't know it was disappearing. We only noticed, years later, standing in our own basements surrounded by boxes we've never opened, that something about the room felt hollow in a way we couldn't quite name. If you grew up with a father who still went downstairs after dinner, even into the 1950s or 1960s, long after the worst of the Depression had passed, you were watching the tail end of something that had once been necessary for survival and had become, by then, simply a way of living. The habit didn't disappear the moment the crisis ended. A Depression-era habit did not disappear when the decade ended. It stayed in drawers, kitchens, and basements for years, carried forward by people who had learned, the hard way, that a family's security did not come from what it could buy. It came from what it could still do with its own two hands. Consider for a moment what that basement actually protected against. It was not simply protecting against a broken chair or a torn coat. It was protecting against helplessness itself, the feeling and the reality of a family that could not respond to its own problems without outside help it might not have the money to pay for. That is the real inheritance this room left behind, more than any single tool or jar of nails. It left behind the quiet, stubborn belief that a family, even a poor one, did not have to wait for someone else to solve its problems. It could solve a lot of them itself, in a room under the house that nobody bragged about, because there was nothing to brag about. It was simply what a home needed in order to keep working. Your grandmother did not need a subscription, a gadget, or a delivery app to keep a family functioning. Your grandfather did not need a service call to fix a chair leg or a fence post. They needed a workbench, a coffee can of saved nails, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing that replacing something you could still repair was a waste no family in hard times could afford. We became the first generations to pay more and no less, and it did not happen because we grew lazy or careless. It happened because convenience, marketed relentlessly as progress, slowly convinced entire households that the skills their parents and grandparents relied on were no longer worth the time it took to learn them. But those skills are still real. They still work exactly the way they worked then. A chair leg can still be glued and clamped instead of thrown away. A hem can still be stitched instead of replaced. A tool can still be sharpened instead of discarded. The basement did not stop being useful. Most families simply stopped using it that way. And maybe that's the real reason this room still pulls at something in people who never lived through the Depression themselves. Because even without the memory of the 1930s directly, a lot of us carry the echo of it, in a father who fixed everything without being asked, in a grandmother who never explained why she saved every button, in a basement that smelled like sawdust and quiet effort every time we were sent downstairs to fetch something. We may not remember the fear that built that room, but we remember the safety it created. And somewhere in the back of a lot of minds, there is still a small, stubborn hope that a family could go back to being that kind of prepared, not because money is guaranteed to run out again, but because knowing you could handle it if it did is its own kind of peace. That peace is what the basement really held. Not clutter, not junk waiting to be sorted someday. A quiet, physical proof that the people living in that house were not, and would not be, helpless. So the next time someone mentions an old basement, theirs, their parents', their grandparents', try to picture it the way it really was. Not a dumping ground, not a place for things nobody wanted to deal with. A workshop, a shelter, a quiet promise that whatever broke in that house, someone still knew how to fix it. The basement was never really about tools, or jars, or coils of wire saved for no obvious reason. It was about a family refusing to be defeated by something as small as a cracked chair leg or a torn coat sleeve. It was about a father who came home tired, sometimes from a job, sometimes from the discouraging search for one, and still found the will to go downstairs and solve one more problem with his own hands. The Depression years were not gentle, and nothing about that time deserves to be remembered as easy or simple. There was real fear in those basements, real worry about whether a family could keep going another week, another winter, another year. But inside that fear, something valuable was built. A habit of preparedness, of patience, of quiet self-reliance that didn't disappear when the crisis ended. It stayed in homes for decades afterward, carried forward by people who never forgot what it felt like to need something they couldn't easily replace. That habit is largely gone now, not because people today are less capable, but because an entire way of living was slowly replaced by something faster and more convenient. And convenience, for all it has given us, quietly took something away too. It took away the sense that a home could defend itself, that a family, with nothing more than a workbench and a little patience, was never entirely at the mercy of the world outside. They were poor, sometimes, but they were not helpless. And maybe that is the real lesson this room still has to offer, decades after most of us stopped going downstairs to fix anything at all. If this brought back a memory of your father's workbench, your grandfather's tools, or a basement that smelled like sawdust and quiet work, subscribe to the Depression-era home, like this video, and tell us in the comments what your father, grandfather, or someone in your family used to fix instead of replace. Share it with someone who remembers that basement too. Your memory might be the reason someone else remembers theirs.